WNYC is supported by the Museum at FIT, presenting Ivy Style, an exhibition focusing on the significance of the preppy style in menswear from the early 20th century through today, now through January 5th. More at fitnyc.edu/museum.
Hi, this is Leonard Lopate. You're listening to WNYC On Demand. Podcasts, streaming, and MP3 downloads available when you want to listen at wnyc.org and iTunes. We might think that we live in a science-oriented world, but Daniel Botkin argues that many of our ideas about the earth and nature continue to be influenced by ancient myths and religion. Mr. Botkin is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Marine Biology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and he also has degrees in physics and literature. He's worked as a professional journalist. His latest book, The Moon in the Nautilus Shell, Discordant Harmonies Reconsidered, calls for new policies, new laws, and new ways of thinking about conservation and the environment. It's published by Oxford University Press. I'm very pleased it has brought Professor Botkin to our show today. Hello. And Professor Emeritus means that you're not really teaching anymore.
That's right. And thank you very much for having me on your program. But that's right. It means that I'm getting to do all the things I always wanted to do and like to do. I still do research. I still write. I give talks. I get to go out into nature. I have
But you don't have to grade papers anymore.
I don't have to grade papers, and I don't have to deal with academic politics.
Was your 1990 book, Discordant Harmonies, the first to challenge the view that nature ideally exists in a constant state of perfect balance unless it's disturbed by human influence?
It was the first book by a scientist who worked on the environment to make that claim. Yes, it was.
And how was that point of view received at the time?
It got a kind of dichotomous view. First of all, it got a significant amount of press coverage of people writing, really, this is quite amazing that this could be. And then there were the people who thought like I did and thought it was really good, and then it upset an awful lot of people. And it still upsets people.
Well, are you still subscribing to the ideas in that book? We're now 32 years later.
Oh, yes. Yes. The reason I wrote the new book was that I had hoped that
22 years later. I'm sorry, my math is terrible.
Sorry. The reason I wrote the new book was that I had hoped that the original one, Discordant Harmonies, would persuade everybody, including people who are writing the laws, the policies, the actions, and doing the science, that nature's always changing. It isn't in a perfect balance. But that didn't happen anywhere near to the degree that I had hoped. And in fact, it's still very prevalent. And so I decided I really had to write the book and expand it in a much deeper way.
You're right. Many believe that ecology is still a young science, but in comparison to most modern sciences, it's not young, but simply retarded.
That's right. I wrote that wondering if I was really going to upset a lot of my colleagues. But it's retarded in the sense that, for example, one of the major equations still used to manage fisheries and wildlife and marine mammals was just invented in 1838, and it still dominates how people do things. So it's retarded in a time sense.
But we've had a number of people argue that that is not the way to do things, and they've made convincing arguments. It's just a matter of getting government and agencies to change the way they read the latest data?
No, it isn't just that. It's still very dominant in how scientists look at it. For example, I was invited to come out and give a 2-day seminar to the Department of Natural Resources, to one of the major states in the United States. And I went out, and because all the people there managing the wildlife and the forest believed in a balance of nature, and I spent 2 days talking with them, and the man who invited me told me afterwards that the people actually cried to understand that nature wasn't in balance. Isn't that something? These are scientists. And then when it comes to global warming, Jim Hansen, who's the acknowledged expert about global warming, he says that we are destabilizing the Earth's climate system. But the climate is always changing. I mean, Mark Twain told us that. It's always changing. It's a system that's never been stable. So you can't destabilize a system that's never been stable. And then they talk about tipping points. Well, the only kinds of systems that can have tipping points are stable systems. If it's not stable and always changing, you have to think about it differently. So a lot of the science that's going on now about environment is still based very much on the idea of the balance of nature.
So are you saying that both sides of this debate, as it's been posited, are wrong, that the climate change deniers are wrong, but the people who also are saying that this is a unique situation, unlike the other ones that led to ice ages and warming periods afterward, that they're wrong too?
Well, let me put it this way. I started working on the possible environmental effects of global warming 40 years ago, 1968. There was just a few of us concerned about it then, a few climatologists, ecologists, meteorologists.
Were you seeing data that was leading you to think that way?
Yes. By 1973, there was this wonderful data from Mauna Loa Observatory that showed that carbon dioxide was definitely increasing, and we were going through a warming trend. And so at that time, it seemed quite definite that there was a human-caused global warming. And then I developed the first successful computer model of an ecosystem. I did it at IBM, and it grows forests, and it takes weather into account. And so we started to use that to make forecasts about what was likely to happen given a human-induced global warming. And the information in the 1980s and 90s continued to support that. Now, some remarkable things have happened since the year 2000. See, the point of view I always take is you've got to stay with the data. You've got to stay with observation. So that's all I do. I keep looking for information. And so what's happened since 2000 is that there's wonderful ice cores from Antarctica going back 800,000 years. And they show that carbon dioxide change lags temperature change by an average of 800 years. And then there's a new paper just in press in one of the major geological journals that says that in the last decade or so, carbon dioxide change has lagged temperature change by 11 to 12 months. Well, if carbon dioxide change lags temperature change, then it can't be the cause. So, what you have to say is we're definitely living in a warming period, and there are going to be definite effects about it, and we will want to do things about it. But it's turning out, contrary to what I believed in the 1990s, that it may not be our fault. And in fact, what correlates best with temperature change right now is the solar variation. Carbon dioxide is increasing very greatly, but the temperature is increasing slightly.
So this is what global warming climate change deniers are saying as well. It may not be our fault. In fact, it isn't our fault. When you see the melting of the glaciers in Greenland to a point that perhaps has never happened before in Earth's history, you don't think that we have done something to push what might have been a kind of a natural movement in a lot quicker into this sort of change? This is not a slow development. This has been a very quick development.
Well, there's a lot of other things going on. Now, see, but to go back to your first point, I've always tried to stay right in the middle, to stay with the facts. And unfortunately, that makes people on both sides very irritated, but I try to stay with the truth. But we just published a paper looking at sea ice change using records from old whaling ships in the 19th century, comparing it to modern times. And things aren't as different as you would think. The Northwest Passage has been opened before. We know that because there's a DNA exchange between bowhead whales from the Pacific and the Atlantic. So these kind of changes have happened. And what's been really surprising also in the last decade is the climatologists who do the history of it have discovered that there have been changes that have been as warm and as fast in the past. So although we're living in a warming trend, and there's lots of consequence for us, and we have to do things about it, it isn't this moral issue that somehow we've sinned against nature.
My guest is Daniel B. Botkin. His book, The Moon in the Nautilus Shell, Discordant Harmonies Reconsidered, From Climate Change to Species Extinction, How Life Persists in an Ever-Changing World. It's published by Oxford University Press. This is WNYC, WNYC.org. I'm Leonard Lopate. Can you explain that title, The Moon in the Nautilus Shell?
Yes, the last chapter, there's this wonderful story that I love. The nautilus is this seashell creature, and it has been around for hundreds of millions of years. And every day it lays down another layer, and every lunar month it lays down a layer. And the ancient ones from hundreds of thousands of years ago, hundreds of millions of years ago, show that there were very few days between a lunar month, which tells us that the moon has been moving away from the Earth and taking longer and longer to go around. So it shows the connectedness between life and the planets and how all of us are connected. So it's this amazing story. And one of the themes of my book is how deeply we are connected to nature in ways we often don't understand.
Now, why would the moon be moving away from Earth? As I've always understood it, there is this equal gravitational pull, the Earth keeping the moon in place, and then the sun and other bodies pulling the moon away.
One of the things that are the tides, which cause friction and cause a loss of the energy, and so the moon is just slowly getting further away because it's the speed, the energy involved in moving it around is getting to be less and less.
In the interview with the New York Times 10 years ago, you said that sustainability is a much more fashionable word in international circles than in the United States. Is that still the case?
No, it's very fashionable now. The problem with sustainability is that it's another one of those phrases that sounds very good, but nobody's agreed on a definition for it. And so you like it very much. You want sustainable forests, sustainable elephants, sustainable polar bears.
Agriculture.
Sustainable agriculture, sustainable society, sustainable intellectual thought. But it gets very hard because we haven't gotten agreed on definitions. So then you talk about sustainable economic development. Now, what could that possibly mean? So it's a work in progress, and so it's a good term to be thinking about. But we can't just jump in and apply it right away because we aren't quite sure how to think about it.
What do you see as some of the biggest misconceptions we have about nature?
That nature left by itself achieves a perfect form, and that it's...
This is the Gaia theory?
It's connected to the Gaia theory, yes, but it's a little bit different. It's the classic balance of nature idea, that the gods are after the Judeo-Christian beginning, that God being perfect and all-powerful, or with the Greeks and Romans, the gods were being powerful and all knowledgeable. They had to make a perfect world. And so anything changed had to be less than perfect, and therefore nature must be perfect. That's still in a lot of the environmental ideas. And so then the question is, why isn't it perfect? Well, the blame always comes to us, because either we were put here to be the final cog in the machinery of nature and we're not doing our job, or it's perfect without us and we just mess things up.
Or the third approach is something we hear from Senator Tom Coburn, who says that God is in the heavens, and whatever's happening is what God wants, and God would not ruin the world for man.
Well, okay, I come at this as a scientist and empiricist, and that doesn't connect. I'm talking about what we can talk about as scientific and testable ideas.
But you're also suggesting that we're relying on myth. And ideas like what the Greek gods were all about and the Judeo-Christian concepts when we're talking about much more complex scientific things.
Yes, it's still very dominant. And to be clear about it, it still affects the science as well as affects the laws and policies.
Well, a recent Gallup poll reveals that 46% of Americans believe in creationism.
There's a serious problem today about anti-science. We hear about it, and I wish that this would be one of the things that presidential candidates would debate, because science obviously has been such a key to the success of America, not only in its creativity, but in its technological success as the leader in the world. And to have this anti-science emotional coming forward is very poor for the United States in the long run, and it has to be dealt with. And there's things we can do that are very important to overcome that.
Such as?
Citizen science is important. There's a lot of things that people can do. Get them participating in science. There's such marvelous new methods of measuring things with GPS and other things. I did work on salmon for 10 years for the states of Oregon and Washington. And there was one town, Long Beach, Washington, and there was a river near them that flowed into the Columbia. And they wanted to know how many salmon were going up, and they couldn't get the government to do it. So they got frustrated, and they got the high school students to come out. They put a net across the river. The salmon would come up. They'd run into the net. They'd pick them up, mark them down as counted, and put them on the other side. There's lots of things that ordinary citizens can do to become appreciative, to be involved, to be positive, constructive, and to become better aware of what science is.
Why do you think these anti-science feelings, where do you think they come from?
Well, at several levels. One is, at a very deep philosophical level, you could ask where we are in terms of what's called the Cartesian rationality. We might be at the end of the age of rationality. Rational thinking is a relatively modern thing. It starts, with Descartes, with Newton, and so forth. And it's unusual in human societies. And so at one very deep level, we seem to be moving away from it.
In the just the past week, Great Britain released online the old weather project. They posted raw data of temperature and weather changes since World War I. Have you looked at them?
I haven't seen that new data, no.
So you don't know whether they affect your conclusions?
No, but we've looked thoroughly at many kinds of weather data, and I've worked with the people at the Hadley Meteorological Center in Great Britain and looked at their information.
Does nature have a stable state that we're disturbing? Well, biologist Daniel Botkin argues against it in his latest book, The Moon and the Nautilus Shell, Discordant Harmonies Reconsidered, which is published by Oxford University Press. And we will continue our conversation after we take a little break. Stay with us. We are back with Daniel B. Botkin, Professor Emeritus in, that's a real department, Ecology, Evolution, and Marine Biology?
Right. They couldn't, a group of scientists that couldn't agree with anybody else got together.
It's at the University of California, Santa Barbara, although these days you're living here.
In New York City.
The book, The Moon in the Nautilus Shell, Discordant Harmonies Reconsidered, is published by Oxford University Press. Isn't the acceptance of change an important concept in your theory? How does that work in regard to changes in nature?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking. Nature is always changing. And so what we have to do is understand that. And the advantage of understanding it is that once you understand that change is natural, that means that living things have evolved with and adapted to, and many require change. And so it gives you a way of measuring. So you can say, well, if actions we take as people are natural in kind and degree, meaning that they've been the kind of change has been around for millions of years, then they're likely to be benign. So forest fires that are natural in degree and kind are important to many forests, whereas novel changes like adding certain kinds of artificial chemical toxins to the environment, nothing's had a chance to evolve and adapt to them. And so we ought to be very careful when we do that.
So where do you stand on the idea that some biologists and anthropologists like Paul Martin have, that nature wasn't nature since the arrival of human beings?
People have, as long as people have been on the earth, people have always been part of nature and changed nature.
We've done more to change nature than any other inhabitant of Earth.
Oh, yes. Yes, we have. We have. But you'd be impressed. There's evidence, for example, from a very long time ago that people in Denmark before agriculture, completely changed the landscape. And one of the stories I tell in my book is about Hutchison Memorial Forest, believed to be the only virgin forest left in New Jersey. It was the only uncut stand. And it was supposed to stay in this perfect state of oaks and hickories, but it was changing, was becoming sugar maple. And why? It turned out because the Indians burned that area on the average of every 10 years. And the early explorers like Hudson mentioned this. Why? To chase the game, make it easier to go through. And since 1701, this forest had been owned by a Dutch family and never been burned, never been cut. And so it was changing completely. And so the puzzle was, what do? We set aside this to represent nature as it was supposed to be, and nature's not being fair. It's becoming something it never was before. So people have always had strong interactions. And it doesn't mean that any action we do with nature is good. Of course not. We have to be very, very careful. But we have to recognize that we're part of nature and treat nature with great respect.
Well, but I'm not sure I understand whether you think that we are a cause of global warming or not.
At this point, you have to be kind of agnostic about it, because if carbon dioxide change is lagging temperature change, then us adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere cannot be the cause of the climate change. Now, there's other things we're doing: habitat destruction, changing large areas of how the land appears. Species
extinction is on the increase.
Oh, yeah. There's lots of bad things happening about the environment that we want to take action on. In fact, that's one of my concerns, that we may be distracted by an issue that has become so politicized that we're missing the really important ones. We need to focus on habitat destruction, on endangered species, on these ideas of sustainability. There's a great many things we need to do. We have to look at how we're going to provide energy in the future in a way that's benign for the environment. We have to make sure that there's water supply, not just for ourselves, but for all wild creatures. Fresh water, which we are overusing, and the list goes on and on.
But can't those things be of concern along with concerns about climate change? I mean, NASA feels that climate change is should be a major concern.
Yes, I think the best approach here is to take actions that are both beneficial directly and also helpful to climate change. For example, a lot of habitat destruction. There was one of the major environmental groups said that something like 40 million acres of tropical rainforests had been cut down in Indonesia to plant oil palms, on the grounds that these would be biofuels that would help reduce the carbon buildup. But meanwhile, you've destroyed the habitat of orangutans and many other species. So that works against itself. So that's not the approach you want to take.
And that was also an area that was producing a lot of oxygen
right.
through photosynthesis that, all of these old rainforests have been seen as the lungs of the planet.
Right. So what I'm trying to say is that you want to take actions that are very constructive for environment.
Well, how have we gone so wrong? Earth Day is from the 1960s, isn't it?
Right.
And the whole environmental movement, I remember hearing the word ecology for the first time in the early 1960s. It seems that despite all of our concerns, we're moving backward.
In some ways we are. Now, there's a lot of good things happening in environmental sciences. In particular, some of the really good things are like the involvement in ability to do DNA analysis, to study evolution, neurophysiology, so you can track how animal behavior changes in very specific ways, which has implications for studies of autism and other things. There's many good things going on. But I think the problem is that people have always been connected to nature, and we've always had this dichotomy about whether we should dominate nature, how we connect to nature. And Henry David Thoreau, I think, had it about as right as anybody. He was a very good practicing scientist, but he also had a very deep spiritual connection to nature. And he was able to bring both of those together. And although he liked wilderness, and I personally love wilderness, he said he could never live there that it was barren and a poet would pine there. What he really liked was the swamp by the edge of town. He liked his daily walks in Walden. And so it's that combination. But what I'm saying is that this conflict is very, very deep-seated. And an irony of our time is that we know more about nature than any other human civilization. And yet we're the most confused about where we fit in.
Can you tell us about what happened with the moose on Isle Royale?
Yes, well, the moose, we went out, my first big research project in wilderness was to study the moose at Isle Royale, which is a wonderful wilderness island. It's 45 miles long, 8 miles wide in Lake Superior, very cold, and there are wolves that prey on the moose. And we went out there to find out what we believed at that time, I was just starting out, that there was a balance of nature. And we went out to look for what caused that balance of nature. And we asked what really was controlling the population of moose. And among other things, because the wolves kill the moose when they can and eat them, but we found the ultimate limiting factor was actually going to be the amount of sodium they could get in their food. So that population has varied continuously. It's a wonderful example. It's one of the longest studied wildlife predator-prey, and the animals are always changing in abundance.
If the wolves kept the moose from becoming overabundant, what was keeping the wolves from becoming overabundant?
So that's one of the classic questions that Cicero asked, that Jefferson wrote about.
I'm in good company.
Yeah, oh, right, and Jefferson asked. And the classic answer was that the animals that are benign and beneficial are highly productive and therefore they're good for people. And the vicious and mean animals, the predators, are made so they don't reproduce very quickly. But actually, the theories are, the balance of nature theories say that predator and prey will always keep each other in balance. But the reality is that the predator rarely keeps the prey in a perfect balance. They're always varying greatly. Right now, the population of wolves is way down. There's about 9. And the population of moose has just varied a lot. So there's some control, but not a perfect control.
Well, the prey depend on vegetation to eat to keep them alive. So if whether the wolves are killing the moose or not, if there aren't enough plants around for the moose to eat, the moose are going to die off.
Yes, so you have to start thinking about nature as this great dance of many things happening simultaneously, and many things change all the time. And so the populations come and go. The moose only got to Isle Royale about 1900. Before that, there were caribou. Nobody's quite sure why there was a change. And then the wolves arrived about 1945. So we live in this very dynamic, changing world, which is only partially anything like stable.
Is that what you're calling an organic view of nature?
No, not quite, but it connects to that. Now, there were 3 classical explanations for nature. One was this balance of nature God-given. The other, which Lucretius wrote about, was that Mother Nature was really a creature, a living creature. And they actually believed Mother Nature had organs, and that, unfortunately, we're living at a time when Mother Nature's getting old. So the volcanoes are the warts on her skin, and the mountains are the wrinkles. And so we missed the great time. That's the organic view.
Now, where does James Lovelock and his book that I mentioned earlier, Gaia, A New Look at Life on Earth, come into this story?
Well, actually, I worked very closely with his close colleague, Lynn Margulis, who died last year, as one of the top biologists in the 20th century. And I helped her understand ecology, so there's some connection there. His idea, there's 3 parts to his idea. One is that life is a planetary phenomenon, and that I agree with completely, that it really is. It takes a planet to maintain life over a long time. The second idea is that life has exerts some control over the global environment, and I agree with that. Then he gets misinterpreted to a third part, which he says he doesn't mean, that life does this on purpose. And that's where you get over to creationism and you get away from science. So the first two parts are consistent. You know that he just recently changed his views about climate change, by the way.
And where does he stand now?
I think very similar to mine, which is to say you've got to be agnostic about it right now.
What do you think of the current conservation programs for endangered species?
Well, I've done a lot of work on endangered species. And
because, it's a big political hot potato still.
Oh, yeah. Well, can you give me a little more specific answer? I mean, because that's a huge question. I'm in favor of saving endangered species, and I've done work on it.
Then there are some people who say, wait a minute, if we worry about some little frog, then we're losing thousands of lives at a time, of jobs at a time when we have high unemployment.
There are going to have to be made some very difficult choices, and our society has to get together around a scientific base to decide how we're going to choose. We can't save every species. And the average fate, the fate of every species eventually is extinction. The average longevity of mammals is about 750,000 years. And so, and it's about one species a year that goes extinct. So
how do we compare with the woolly mammoth?
Well, we're doing very well. We've been around quite a long time.
Well, we're the ones who are accelerating other animals' extinction.
We are. We're having a big effect, and I'm very much in favor of doing everything we can to save endangered species.
And Matt left a comment on our show page asking your thoughts on evidence linking carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere to ocean acidification.
Okay, well, I'm not an oceanographer, so I can't really give you a very tight answer for that. If you look strictly at what's called the physical chemistry of carbon dioxide exchange between the atmosphere and the ocean, it's very hard for the amount of change we put into the atmosphere of carbon dioxide to do a significant acidification. But something's going on. And so it may be there's some biological mechanisms, but this goes way beyond my own knowledge.
2 years ago, you published a book called Powering the Future, A Scientist's Guide to Energy Independence. Is energy independence possible?
It is possible. It's expensive, and I argue strongly that we should go to solar and wind.
Not hydraulic fracking.
Not hydraulic fracking, right. And I think the current battle right now is boiling down to solar versus shale gas. And there's many reasons to want to go with solar and wind. They are environmentally comparatively benign. Here's an interesting fact. 49% of the fresh water used in the United States is to cool nuclear and fossil fuel power plants. And we are at the limit of our use of our fresh water. And so
can we run out of drinking water?
The city of San Diego on September 28th just signed a contract to pay more than $2,000 an acre foot. That's the amount of water to cover an acre with a foot of water. From desalinization, they're running out of water. It used to cost hundreds of dollars. Well, so yes, we are running out of water.
We're about to have a presidential election. We have very little time. Do you see the politics of Washington having much of an impact?
The very disappointing thing is that these are very fundamental questions, and Washington there's not much happening in the debates. I really wish that there'd be a lot going on in the debates. I mean, one of the things that's very important that they ought to talk about, there is a legitimate question in democracy about how strong the government should be, what should be the role of government. And so solar energy and wind are always being blamed because they're subsidized. But subsidies have often played a very important role. For example, Hoover Dam, which made Las Vegas possible, was built by government funding, and Hoover passed the bill. And
we had the highway systems and railroads, all supported by government funding.
Right.
Daniel B. Botkin's The Moon in the Nautilus Shell is published by Oxford University Press. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to WNYC On Demand. Please check out the other programs at wnyc.org or on iTunes. This is a free service made available by our listeners. Become a member of WNYC today. 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 WNYC